They didn't even wait until after the funeral. That was the first sign. I'm Amber, 29 years old, and last month my grandfather left me his entire estate worth over $2 million. The next morning, my mother Patricia demanded I sign it over to her. When I refused, she stared at me like I had just slapped her. Then she said, "You always were an ungrateful child." This morning, I received a text about an urgent family meeting. No explanation, just a location, the house I grew up in. As I walked into that familiar doorway, the air felt heavier than I remembered. They were all there, my mother, stepfather Craig, my brother Jason, my sister Rachel, and two men in tailored suits who looked like they hadn't blinked since arriving. My mother crossed her arms and smiled coldly. "Meet our lawyers." I wasn't prepared for what happened next. When I was a child, I used to think that love looked like patience. My grandfather Harold had that kind of love, slow, observant, generous in ways that didn't need to be said aloud. I'd sit beside him in his study, surrounded by ledgers and dusty books, pretending to understand his numbers while he pointed to charts and receipts. "You've got a good head for business, kiddo," he said once, when I was 13 and had spotted an error in an inventory report. He looked at me like I mattered. My mother never had much use for patience. Or for me, really. Patricia grew up believing she was entitled to softness without ever offering any in return. She married 3 times, each husband weaker than the last, and each time the household grew more chaotic. Our house was always filled with noise, shouting, plastic bags from high-end stores, televisions turned up too loud. The silence after she left a room was a relief I didn't understand until years later. Craig, her third husband and my stepfather, had a permanent frown etched into his face. He enabled her the way a worn couch enables someone to never stand up again. When they remortgaged the house for the second time, I remember hearing Grandpa's voice, low and sharp, coming from the kitchen. "You're setting your kids up for failure." Patricia had laughed, tossed her hair, and said, "That's your opinion, Harold." When Grandpa started taking me to his main store on Saturdays, it felt like stepping into a different life. Employees respected him. He called them by name. He let me sit in on supplier meetings and taught me how to calculate margins. He spoke to me like I could understand the world, even when I wasn't sure I could. When I was ready for college, he offered to pay. But Patricia intercepted. Suddenly, the money he'd promised me was urgently needed for Jason's car or Rachel's cosmetic procedures. I took out loans instead and got a job shelving books at the university library. I didn't complain. That's not how I was raised, at least, not by him. In his last year, Grandpa became more direct. "You're the only one in this family who understands what money actually is," he told me in the hospital once, gripping my hand tighter than expected. "Not what it buys, but what it means." I nodded. I think I knew even then that I'd be standing alone someday. That day came faster than I expected. The funeral was quiet. Grandpa had kept his circle small, especially in the last few years. When the will was read a week later, I almost couldn't believe it. Everything, his stores, his house, his investments, was left to me. Not a trust, not a joint inheritance. Me. Sole heir. Patricia's face, when the lawyer said my name, tightened like a thread pulled too far. She didn't confront me in front of everyone. She waited until we were alone in the parking lot. Her tone was calm, but her eyes were wild. "Sign it over, Amber," she said. "You know this was never supposed to be yours." "No," I said quietly. And just like that, she became a stranger. Now, standing in my childhood home again, facing her and the lawyers she'd hired, I realized this wasn't about grief. This was war. One of the lawyers spoke first. "Miss Lawrence, your mother is requesting a formal reassignment of estate assets on the grounds of mental coercion and undue influence." I stared at him, then at her. "You're saying I manipulated my grandfather?" She didn't answer. She didn't have to. My brother Jason looked away. Rachel stared at her nails. I took a slow breath. My voice stayed steady. "You won't get it." Patricia smiled again, but it didn't reach her eyes. "You really think this is about getting it," she said. "It's about making sure you remember where you came from." Then she slid a folder across the table. Inside were printed screenshots, photos, bank statements, my old student loan forms. And then, something else. A letter. Not in my handwriting. She said, "You should read it carefully." I did. And when I looked up again, something in my chest had shifted. Because I knew now what they were willing to do. And I knew I would never be safe in this family again. But I also knew something they didn't. They'd made their move. Now it was my turn. I didn't cry when I left the house. But halfway down the block, my hand started shaking on the steering wheel. The letter wasn't real. At least, not in the way they wanted it to be. It was dated 2 years ago and supposedly written by my grandfather, saying he was under pressure, that he feared I might be taking advantage of his declining health. The signature was his, but not quite. It looked like a copy of something real, lifted and imitated by someone who knew just enough to be dangerous. Patricia must have found an old card or birthday note. Jason had access to the house during his visits, and Rachel worked at a printing firm briefly last summer. That was enough for me to imagine how they'd pulled it off. I drove straight past my apartment and ended up parked outside one of Grandpa's hardware stores instead. The flagship. The one he built from the ground up. I sat there, staring at the glowing closed sign, thinking about the Saturdays we used to spend in that exact building. The smell of sawdust. The worn stool he kept behind the register. The notebook with grease-stained corners where he'd jot down inventory discrepancies by hand, even though everything was digitized by then. My chest ached in that slow, crushing way that grief often returns, months later, when everyone else has stopped asking how you're doing. I didn't go inside. I just sat there, remembering. I could still hear his voice from that last hospital visit. "When the time comes, there will be pressure." I hadn't understood what he meant. Not fully. Not until today. There was a kind of quiet desperation in that fake letter. Whoever wrote it wasn't trying to be subtle, they were trying to plant doubt. Not just in others, but in me. That's what made it dangerous. The seed wasn't meant to bloom in a courtroom. It was meant to take root in my own mind. And I realized then what this was really about. Control. Not the money itself, not even the estate. It was about refusing to accept that he had chosen me. That despite everything, someone in this family had believed I was enough. And that was the real betrayal. To them. When I finally made it home, I pulled out the wooden box Grandpa had given me on my 25th birthday. He'd called it a sentimental insurance policy. At the time, I thought it was just a sweet gesture, photos, handwritten notes, copies of old business reports. But now, with everything unfolding the way it was, I saw it differently. He'd left breadcrumbs. One of the items was a letter, real and unmistakably his. I'd read it a dozen times over the years, but this time I read it like evidence. Like intention. "Amber," it said, "I chose you because you see people. You see what things cost, not just in dollars, but in time, in labor, in dignity. That's why you'll be fine. That's why they'll come for you." There was no bitterness in his words. Just recognition. In a man like Harold Lawrence, that counted for everything. My relationship with him had always been quiet. Steady. There was no favoritism in it, not the kind people like Patricia resented. There was just trust. And consistency. That's what made it radical in a family like mine. From as early as I could remember, my mother made it clear that love was a currency. One she controlled. If you did what she asked, you earned it. If you didn't, she withheld it. That was the rhythm of our home. She'd grown up in comfort, the only child of a man who worked himself into the ground building a business she never had any interest in. And somehow, she'd always seen that as a kind of failure on his part, not a legacy, but a burden. One he'd eventually tried to pass on to someone more capable. Me. Even as a kid, I knew I wasn't what she wanted. I was too quiet, too observant. I asked too many questions and never seemed to need her in the way she demanded to be needed. She called me stoic like it was a slur. I overheard her once, telling a friend I was emotionally distant, that I acted like an adult even when I was 6. Meanwhile, Jason was her golden boy, even after he dropped out of community college twice. Rachel, with her endless health issues, some real, most not, was the delicate one, the center of every conversation. I existed in the spaces between. It was Grandpa who filled them. He was the one who noticed when I stopped eating dinner at the table. The one who slipped me $20 bills for emergencies after Patricia cut off my lunch money. The one who waited in the car after parent-teacher conferences while she handled the discussions with staff. I didn't know what she said during those meetings, but I knew how I felt when I saw his face afterward. Like I hadn't been erased entirely. Those moments taught me something, that survival wasn't about winning affection. It was about knowing where to look for it. That understanding became armor. Especially later, when the money came into play. I never expected to inherit anything. I assumed, if anything, that Patricia would manipulate him into dividing things more evenly, if only to avoid drama. But she miscalculated. She underestimated how deeply he'd been paying attention. How deliberately he'd been preparing me. Now they were all trying to undo it. Not just with words, but with tactics. Lawyers, forged documents, implied threats. The letter had one line underlined twice: "I fear Amber may be isolating me from the rest of the family." I could picture them justifying it to themselves. "We're only taking back what's ours." She manipulated him. She always thought she was better than us. It wasn't about facts. It never had been. I sat on the floor of my apartment that night, surrounded by papers and memories. I took out every document Grandpa had ever given me, contracts, trust amendments, old tax returns, and spread them around me like a shield. And I realized something that chilled me. They weren't going to stop. Even if I won in court, even if the will held up and their forged letter was dismissed, they'd find other ways. Emotional sabotage. Social humiliation. Isolation. That's when I knew. This wasn't going to be about inheritance anymore. This was going to be about identity. And I needed to decide who I was willing to become in order to protect what I'd been entrusted with. I closed the box. And I picked up the phone. Not to call them. To call someone I hadn't spoken to in over a year. Someone who once told me, "If they ever try anything, you come to me first." Her voice, when she answered, was just as steady as I remembered. "Amber," she said. "I was wondering when I'd hear from you." I said, "They're making their move." There was a pause, then, "Good. Let's make ours." The first threat came in silence, 3 days without a word, and then a registered letter shoved into my mailbox like an afterthought. It was thick, sealed in heavy cardstock with my name typed in sharp black font. No return address, just a Manhattan legal firm I didn't recognize. I opened it on the kitchen counter, fingers steady despite the tightening in my chest. The petition inside was formal, almost sterile, a legal motion to freeze the estate's accounts pending investigation into potential undue influence and elder coercion. Patricia's name sat neatly under the complainant line. So did Craig's. And Jason's. Even Rachel had signed her name, though I doubted she read a word. That's when it began, the steady, calculated unraveling. Overnight, things I'd taken for granted began slipping away. Grandpa's accounts were locked. Emails from his estate attorney went unanswered. His store manager stopped returning my calls. One of them, Dave, a quiet man who'd worked for Grandpa for 18 years, even blocked my number. That one stung. By Friday, a notice arrived from the firm's accountant, stating that payroll and vendor payments were temporarily halted until legal clarity was restored. Not even a courtesy call. I knew what they were doing. They were creating doubt. Manufacturing chaos so that when the time came to argue I wasn't capable, there would be proof, broken systems, panicked employees, unpaid bills. Evidence of instability. All of it carefully engineered. And it worked. Within a week, I started receiving texts from long-lost cousins I hadn't spoken to in years. Messages dressed as concern but soaked in suspicion. "Hey, heard some stuff from Mom. You okay?" I always thought Harold would do the right thing. "I'm sure this is all just a misunderstanding." Even my old high school friend Charlotte messaged, saying someone had mentioned my name at the Chamber of Commerce mixer, something about a quiet power grab. I didn't respond. Because there was no point in defending myself to people who had already chosen a side. The worst came the following Monday. A meeting request from the estate's board, yes, the one Grandpa had set up long ago, mostly filled with longtime advisors and a few external partners. They'd scheduled a performance inquiry regarding my role as designated trustee. I stared at the email until the screen blurred. The meeting wasn't even optional. That night, I sat on my bedroom floor, wrapped in an old sweater that still smelled faintly of cedar and the farmhouse where Grandpa had spent his last summer. I hadn't cried yet, but I felt the tears just behind my ribs, waiting. It wasn't grief. It was the grief underneath, the one that comes from being misunderstood so completely, so publicly, that you begin to wonder if maybe you are the villain in their version of the story. That's when I called her again. "Meet me at the cafe on Broad," she said. "Back booth." Her name is Elise. She's a trust litigation consultant with a sharp memory and a sharper tongue. We met 2 years ago during one of Grandpa's estate planning retreats. She wasn't his lawyer, he already had those, but she was the one he trusted to vet legal vulnerabilities. We'd bonded over coffee, spreadsheets, and mutual disbelief at the way families treat one another when legacy is involved. "You didn't call me to catch up," she said when I slid into the booth across from her. I shook my head. "I need to know what they're planning." She didn't take notes. Didn't open her laptop. Just watched me with that forensic gaze of hers while I explained the petition, the frozen accounts, the shift in public sentiment. When I finished, she said, "They're going to try to get you removed as trustee. They'll argue you're emotionally compromised, unqualified, and that Harold was unduly influenced." I already knew. "What do I do?" I asked. She leaned back, hands folded. "You fight quietly. You document everything. You get ahead of their narrative. And above all, you don't give them emotion." There was a pause. "Amber," she said, voice lower now. "They don't want the estate." "Not really. They want to break your authority. If they can make you hesitate, they've already won." I nodded. Slowly. As if my neck had forgotten how to move. That night, I started compiling the ledger Grandpa and I had worked on in secret. It wasn't financial. It was behavioral. I listed every time Patricia had accessed his accounts without consent. Every time Jason had borrowed from store petty cash. Rachel's cosmetic expenses, billed as medical. Craig's attempt to add himself as a co-owner on one of the vacation properties. It wasn't revenge. It was preservation. I also collected messages, emails from employees Grandpa had praised me to, old letters he'd written in his own hand, video files from our last Christmas together where he'd made a toast about legacy. The real kind. The quiet kind. Elise called 2 days later. "I've found something," she said. "Their attorney? Used to represent one of Harold's old competitors. Guess who testified in that lawsuit? Your grandfather." I didn't have to ask what that meant. The conflict of interest was glaring. She continued, "I can get this injunction dropped. But we need something sharper." "I have records," I said. She paused. "Use them." "But not yet." I was exhausted. I hadn't slept through a night in almost 2 weeks. My apartment felt like a war room, papers everywhere, legal pads stacked on the couch, post-it notes lining the mirror. My phone buzzed around midnight. A message from Rachel. "You're making this harder than it needs to be." I stared at it for a long time. Then I replied, "So are you?" No response. 2 days before the board meeting, Patricia called. I didn't expect the voice to shake me, but it did. She said, "He's not here to protect you anymore." I answered, "He doesn't have to be." There was a silence. Then she hung up. I stood in my kitchen afterward, watching the kettle boil, and wondered if there would ever be a time I'd stop expecting to be loved by her. Even now, some small part of me waited for her to call again and say, "I'm sorry. We were wrong. Come home." But it never came. And that was its own kind of clarity. The night before the board inquiry, Elise sent one last message. "Bring the photos. The ledger. The letter in his handwriting. But wait. Let them corner you first." I nodded, even though she couldn't see me. Outside, the wind had picked up. I stood by the window for a long time, watching the lights blink across the city skyline. Somewhere down the street, someone was playing music through open windows, soft jazz, the kind Grandpa used to hum while sanding wood in the garage. I closed my eyes and breathed it in. Let them come. I knew exactly who I was now. The building felt colder than I remembered. Or maybe I was just different now, sharper around the edges, less afraid of being uncomfortable. The boardroom sat on the 22nd floor, high enough that the city looked small through the window. Elise arrived before me, already seated with her folders neatly stacked, her eyes scanning the room like a chessboard. She gave a small nod when I entered but said nothing. We didn't need words now. 3 of Grandpa's old advisors filled the chairs across from us. Paul Winters, who had run regional operations for nearly 2 decades. Martha Keene, his longest-standing accountant. And Brent Lewis, a quiet man with tired eyes who had handled legal compliance since before I was born. All 3 of them had been loyal to him. But loyalty to the dead has a way of weakening in the presence of fear. They didn't look hostile. But they didn't look warm either. Brent cleared his throat. "We appreciate you making the time, Amber. There are some concerns we felt needed to be addressed." I nodded once. They opened with questions. Structured. Courteous. Carefully worded to appear objective. Was I aware of the trust's complexity? Had I received any outside legal counsel? Was I familiar with the terms outlining fiduciary responsibility and risk? I answered each one calmly. Factually. No embellishments. No defensiveness. Then Paul asked, "Would you be willing to step aside temporarily, until this challenge from your family is resolved?" That was the pivot. Not a demand. A request. One designed to make refusal sound unreasonable. I said, "No." Silence. Martha adjusted her glasses. "Amber, this isn't an accusation. We're just trying to protect the integrity of the estate." I replied, "So am I." They exchanged glances. Elise reached into her folder and placed 3 documents on the table. "Before any decisions are made," she said, her tone neutral, "I'd ask the board to review these. The first is a notarized letter from Mr. Harold Lawrence, written last year, outlining his rationale for selecting Amber as trustee. The second is a series of email correspondences between Harold and this board regarding the transition plan. The third," she paused, "is a copy of a separate ledger. One that tracks a pattern of unauthorized financial activity by multiple members of the Lawrence family over the last 10 years. Brent looked up sharply. "That was never submitted with the original probate." "It wasn't required," Elise said. "It's not about the will. It's about motive." Paul leaned forward. "You're suggesting the current legal challenge is financially motivated?" I answered, "I'm not suggesting. I'm stating." More silence. Elise didn't press. She let the documents speak. When the meeting ended, no one made a formal ruling. But I didn't need them to. I saw it in the way Martha closed her folder more slowly than necessary. In the way Brent refused to meet my eyes. In Paul's reluctant nod as we stood. Outside the building, the air felt clearer. Elise said, "That bought you time." I replied, "Time's all I need." For the next 10 days, I worked in silence. I kept my distance from social media, stopped responding to messages from extended family, and focused on the small, measurable tasks that made me feel grounded. Rebuilding payroll systems. Reviewing supplier contracts. Quietly reinstating the chain of command Grandpa had set up. Each night, I recorded everything. Who called? What was said? Which managers began to return my emails? Which ones didn't? Dave finally unblocked my number. When I called him, he sounded nervous. He said, "I just didn't want to be caught in the middle." I replied, "You never were." He paused, then added, "Harold trusted you." That was enough. One by one, the others followed. Slowly. Quietly. A few emails at first, then calls. No one offered apologies, but they didn't have to. Their shift in tone said enough. The tide had turned. It was never dramatic. No singular moment of victory. Just the gradual return of stability. Still, Patricia hadn't made her next move. And that made me uneasy. On the 11th day, a letter arrived. This one was hand-delivered, with no legal header. Just 3 sentences. "I've withdrawn the petition. Let's talk." I didn't answer. Instead, I drove to Grandpa's farmhouse. It hadn't been touched since his passing. I'd delayed making decisions about it for months, unsure if I could even face the kitchen without hearing the creak of his chair against the tiles. But I needed to be there now. The place smelled like old wood and lavender. His slippers were still by the door. A stack of newspapers, untouched, sat on the bench beside the window. I didn't cry. I just moved slowly through the rooms, letting the silence do its work. In his study, I found the safe behind the painting. He had once joked, "The most obvious place is often the safest." Inside were documents I'd seen before, insurance forms, property deeds, but also something new. A sealed envelope. My name written in his shaky but unmistakable handwriting. I opened it with trembling fingers. Inside was a single sentence. "You will know what to do when it stops being about fairness and starts being about legacy." I read it 5 times. Because that's what it had always been about. Not fairness. Legacy. That night, I slept in the farmhouse. No dreams. Only a stillness I hadn't felt in weeks. In the morning, I texted Elise. "I'm ready." She replied, "Then we move." There's a stillness before confrontation, like the moment the air stills before a storm finally breaks. I felt it in my chest as I parked in front of my mother's house. The house looked smaller than I remembered. The lawn was manicured, of course. Craig was always obsessive about appearances, but the paint was peeling on the porch rails, and the roses by the mailbox had been replaced with plastic ones. I noticed the details because I needed to. Because when you step into a room where power has always belonged to someone else, every crack becomes leverage. Elise had offered to come with me, but I declined. This wasn't about lawyers anymore. It was personal. And I needed them to see that I could walk in alone, and still be the one in control. They were waiting in the living room. Patricia on the velvet armchair, legs crossed like we were meeting for brunch. Craig beside her, expression unreadable. Jason by the fireplace, trying to look aloof but fidgeting with the cuff of his sleeve. Rachel stood by the window, arms folded, eyes darting. No lawyers this time. No scripts. I stepped in without pausing. My mother spoke first, as I knew she would. She said, "I'm glad you agreed to come." I replied, "You didn't give me a choice. You gave me a summons." Craig started to say something, but Patricia silenced him with a glance. She turned back to me. "I withdrew the petition." I thought that meant something. I didn't respond. She continued, her voice too smooth. "We let things get out of hand. But this estate, it's bigger than you. And you're not thinking clearly. There it was. The pivot back to their preferred narrative. That I was emotional. Overwhelmed. Unfit. Jason stepped forward, tone forced casual. Look, Amber. You got what you wanted. You won. Just, don't ruin it. Grandpa built all this for family. I looked at him. Really looked. And I realized he believed that line. They all did. That what they were doing was reclamation, not theft. I said, he built it for legacy. You all just assumed that meant you. Rachel scoffed. You think you're so righteous? You're not better than us, Amber. You're just smug and lucky. I turned to her. No. I'm prepared. That's not luck. She blinked, thrown off by the calm. My mother stood. You don't know what it's like to raise 3 children on disappointment. Her voice cracked, just slightly, just enough for me to see the crack in the veneer. You don't know what it's like, she repeated, to be the only one who ever had to explain why your father thought so little of you that he gave everything to someone else. I didn't move. Because now I saw it. It wasn't just greed. It was humiliation. Public, bitter humiliation wrapped in years of suppressed resentment. She hadn't lost money. She'd lost face. I said, maybe if you'd spent less time competing with your father, and more time learning from him, you'd understand why he chose someone else. Silence. Then Craig muttered, you don't belong in that chair. I turned slowly. And yet, here I am. I walked to the center of the room and placed the envelope on the table. Inside was a single-page summary, timeline, financials, and the ledger Elise had helped me compile. Not the full documentation. Just enough. I said, here's the pattern. Withdrawals from company funds, misuse of vendor accounts, forged reimbursements. If I submit this to the board, or worse, to the Attorney General, your reputations are gone. Jason's face turned pale. Rachel looked away. I continued, but I won't. Not if this ends now. My mother stepped closer. You're threatening your own family. I met her eyes. No. I'm offering mercy. I expected rage. Screaming. Defiance. What I got instead was stillness. A long pause. And then, Patricia sat down again. Quietly. Like a woman who had finally understood the depth of her loss. Craig reached for the envelope, but she stopped him. She said, we want the farmhouse. It caught me off guard. For a moment, I didn't understand. She clarified. Keep the business. Keep the accounts. We want the house in East Pine. My voice was steady. That was his home. Her eyes flashed. And it's the only place that still feels like it belonged to all of us. I paused. Not because I doubted her sincerity, but because I saw the strategy in it. Giving up the estate was one thing. But the house? That was the emotional center. The symbolic heart. And they wanted to reclaim it, not for use, but for memory. I said, it's not for sale. Jason stepped forward again. Then you really are as cold as she said. I didn't answer. Because I didn't need to be warm. I needed to be clear. Patricia's voice was softer now. You think he was perfect. But he wasn't. He had favorites. And he held grudges. You just happened to be both. I exhaled. And you just happened to believe that made him wrong. She looked at me then, and for the first time in my life, I saw her without the mask. Not the mother I'd grown up with, but the woman beneath the performance. Tired. Beaten. Still dangerous. She said, I hope it was worth it. I said, so do I. Then I turned and walked out. Outside, the sky had shifted. The wind had picked up again, the way it always did before rain. I could feel it in the stillness. In the back of my mind, I knew this wasn't over. Confrontation rarely ends in a single blow. It ends in silence, when no one's willing to keep swinging. But as I reached my car, my phone buzzed. It was a message from Martha Keene. One line. The board has reconvened. They're requesting a follow-up with you. Privately. There's something surreal about being asked to defend your integrity in a room full of people who once believed in it without question. But that's exactly where I found myself, alone, again, waiting for judgment. The board meeting was scheduled in a smaller conference room this time. No city skyline, no long mahogany table. Just a rectangular space with gray carpeting, a pitcher of water, and 4 chairs set in quiet formation. When I arrived, Martha was already there. She didn't smile, but she nodded as I entered, and that was more than I expected. Brent came next, then Paul. All 3 looked tired, but not unfriendly. Just cautious. The kind of caution that comes from knowing they'd nearly let something unravel that they were supposed to protect. "We're not recording this session," Paul said. "This is off record." "For clarity." I nodded once. I didn't sit down right away. I waited until they gestured, then lowered myself into the seat, palms resting quietly in my lap. Brent folded his hands. "We've reviewed the documents you submitted, the ledger, the correspondence, the original transition letters. There's consistency." He didn't say truth. He didn't need to. Martha added, "It's clear to us now that the petition against you was based on personal resentment, not legal merit." They didn't apologize. I didn't expect them to. Paul leaned back. "The estate is stabilized. Employee confidence is recovering. Vendor relationships are intact. That's in large part due to you." The words sounded clinical, but I understood what they were offering. Not praise. Legitimacy. I replied, "I didn't do it for approval." Martha's mouth twitched. "We know." There was a pause. Then Brent asked, "What are your intentions for the estate, Amber?" "Long term." It was the only question that mattered. I answered carefully. "I want to keep the stores open. No selling. No consolidations. Just modernization, quietly. I've started reworking the training programs, the vendor contracts. Grandpa didn't build this to be flashy. He built it to be solid." They listened. I added, "I'll be establishing a foundation under his name. Education grants, small business mentoring. Nothing press-worthy. Just local. Practical. Real." Paul exhaled through his nose. That's what Harold always wanted. I didn't smile. But inside, something softened. When I left the meeting, Elise was waiting downstairs. She didn't ask what happened. She just raised an eyebrow. "They're done testing me," I said. She replied, "No. They just learned it's not worth trying." In the days that followed, the silence returned, but not the dangerous kind. Just the natural quiet that comes after the storm has passed and people are too exhausted to pretend anymore. Patricia didn't reach out again. Jason posted a vague message on social media about boundaries being hard but necessary, which I ignored. Rachel sent one more text, just a single word, "Why?" I didn't respond. There was no version of the story she was willing to understand. Instead, I focused on what I could control. I walked through each of the flagship stores, one at a time. Talked to the managers. Asked questions. Listened. I stood in the backrooms, where the fluorescent lights buzzed and the shelves still held dust from Grandpa's era. I remembered how he used to run his hand along the edge of the doorframe when he was thinking. Like the wood itself helped him stay grounded. I touched it once myself, and for a moment, I understood. The foundation I'd mentioned to the board came together slowly but deliberately. I met with local educators, community organizers, financial planners. I didn't put my name on anything. Just Grandpa's. He would have preferred it that way. The first grant we awarded was to a woman named Sheila, a single mother who wanted to open a repair shop in a small town just outside of Lincoln. I drove out to meet her in person. Her hands were calloused. Her eyes steady. When I told her she was approved, she cried without apology. I didn't. But I felt something shift again. Back at the farmhouse, I started making quiet repairs. Nothing major. Just fixing what time had loosened: hinges, stair rails, the back porch screen. I scrubbed the old floorboards myself, even though I could have hired someone. I needed to feel it beneath my knees. It felt like penance, but for what, I wasn't sure. One evening, Elise called. "I assume you've heard," she said. I hadn't. She told me Patricia had sold the family home. Moved into a small apartment near the lake with Craig. Jason had gone back to Arizona. Rachel was apparently living with someone new, someone older, wealthier, conveniently located in another state. "They're scattering," Elise said. No anchor. I thanked her. We didn't speak long. I sat on the porch after, watching the sky change color. I didn't feel triumphant. I just felt still. I'd never wanted them to fall apart. Only to stop pulling me down with them. The next morning, a letter arrived. No envelope. Just paper, slipped under the farmhouse door. It was from Martha. Short. Handwritten. "Harold was right about you." I read it twice. Then I folded it neatly and placed it in the same wooden box Grandpa had once given me. Next to the real letter. The one in his handwriting. Later that day, I walked the perimeter of the property. The grass had grown high at the edge of the east field. I could still see the spot where we used to sit under the maple tree, sipping lemonade in the quiet. Something inside me stirred. Not pain. Just the beginning of something else. Something I hadn't allowed myself to feel in a long time. I walked back to the house. And I started to write. Healing doesn't feel like triumph. It feels like maintenance, quiet, repetitive, often invisible to anyone else. I wrote every morning now. Not for anyone but myself. Just loose reflections, the kind Grandpa used to keep in the small leather-bound journal he never let anyone else touch. I didn't use anything fancy, just a yellow legal pad and a cheap black pen. There was something honest in the scratch of ink on paper, something that didn't ask to be edited or shared. Some mornings, I sat at the old kitchen table with coffee, watching the sun stretch across the floorboards, and I realized I didn't miss them, not the arguments, not the tension, not the constant performance of love. What I missed was something that had never been given freely to me: certainty. Safety. That vague sense of belonging you're supposed to feel with the people who share your last name. But over time, I stopped waiting for it. The farmhouse became more than a home, it became proof. That steadiness existed. That love could be quiet, structured, deliberate. That legacy wasn't just something you inherited. It was something you earned by choosing to hold the line when everyone else abandoned it. I went back to the stores weekly. Not to micromanage, just to be visible. I made a point of learning names, birthdays, the number of years each employee had been on the team. I asked how their kids were doing. I brought coffee to the early shift. Grandpa used to say people remember small things, not policies. He was right. The store in Lincoln expanded its inventory. We brought in a local contractor to redesign the shelving, modernize the back office systems. Sheila, the woman we awarded the first grant to, sent me a picture of her shop's ribbon cutting. I printed it and pinned it above my desk. The foundation grew, slowly but cleanly. Elise helped structure the governance, and we set limits: no overreach, no family appointments, no donations with strings. Just quiet investment in honest labor. Sometimes I thought about what might have happened if I had walked away instead. If I'd let them take it, or fractured it down the middle in some court-approved compromise. I could have saved myself the grief. But not the guilt. And certainly not the respect, for myself or for what Grandpa left behind. One afternoon in late spring, I found something tucked in the back of a drawer in his old workbench. It was a photograph, folded twice and worn at the edges. Grandpa, younger, maybe mid-30s, standing in front of the first storefront. He was holding a small child, me. I couldn't have been more than 2. He'd written something on the back. A date. And 3 words, "This one sees." I sat with that for a long time. Maybe that's all he'd ever wanted, for someone to see the work. Not just the products or the profits, but the scaffolding underneath. The integrity. The choices no one thanked you for. The wait. He knew I would. That was the inheritance. Not the money. Not the properties. The understanding of wait. Patricia never wrote to me again. Jason sent a Christmas card with no return address, just a signature. Rachel's name came up in a local article once, tied to a real estate deal in Tennessee, but she never reached out. And I didn't chase any of them. I didn't hate them. Not anymore. I just stopped making space for their shadows. The farmhouse got quieter in summer. I started opening the windows at night, letting the breeze through. There was something cleansing about it, the way the air carried the scent of pine and old earth through the hallways. I spent one weekend going through Grandpa's books, ledgers, journals, even old training manuals. I found margin notes, scribbled corrections, occasional jokes. He always corrected in blue ink. That was his way. Pencil for drafts, red for receipts, blue for decisions. In the back of one binder, there was a list. No title, no explanation. Just 10 lines. Goals, maybe. Or reminders. The last line was this: protect the one who listens. It broke me for a moment. Because that's what he had done, all those years. And what I was doing now. Late one evening, Elise came to visit. She brought wine and news. Legal paperwork had been finalized, the petition officially closed with prejudice. Meaning they couldn't come back. We drank quietly on the porch. She said, "So what now?" I replied, "I keep the lights on." She nodded. That was enough. We didn't talk about what it cost. The hours. The relationships. The parts of myself I'd had to confront and shed and mourn. I already knew. The next morning, I woke early. Walked barefoot out to the edge of the east field. The sun hadn't fully risen yet, but the light was coming in soft bands through the trees. I stood where the old maple used to be. The stump was still there. Weathered. Split in 2 places. I placed my hand on it. Not for memory. For continuity. I whispered, not loud, just enough for the wind to carry. I saw it. I still see it. Then I turned and walked back toward the house. The porch light was still on. And I didn't turn it off.